Welcome readers. We would like to introduce the comic series Dreamer'S Throne. When Garrett comes to after a close brush with death, he realizes that he is in a new world, and worse, he's missing an arm and paralyzed from the waist down. A fact that doesn't deter the brutal gang lord whose floor he's crashing on from wanting to throw him out into the street. The only thing standing between Garrett and a cold death at the mercy of the city's scavengers is a plucky young woman, and his own wits. Armed with a system that gives him experience for exploring the new world he is in, Garrett is determined to do whatever it takes to keep himself safe from the threats that press in all around him, even if it means becoming a villain. But the inn and city are far from what they seem. Terrifying creatures lurk around every corner, waiting to prey on the unwary, and there is no weapon that can stop them. A strange lucid dream world hovers on the edge of Garrett's consciousness, and it isn't content to stay a dream. When it starts bleeding into the real world, Garrett realizes that the hostile gangs around him are the least of his worries. A new fantasy literate series by Seth Ring, best-selling author of Nagatara and Battlemage Farmer. Chapter 1. If worries were raindrops, Garrett was certain that insomnium would have long been washed away. As he watched the fat messengers splatter their payload against his window before dripping down in wide rivulets to join the rain-soaked streets, he felt control slipping away from him. The situation was ironic. He was more powerful than ever, his abilities and authority having grown tremendously after he defeated the great ruler of the Dream Agmayoth. Not only had he gained a new class, but the number of abilities he possessed had exploded. His position among the city's gangs had never been stronger. Yet, everywhere he looked, he found problems and challenges that, if not dealt with perfectly, would cause the Klein family to sink into the abyss. Enemies lurked at every turn, watching for a weakness, waiting to pounce. Garrett could think of a dozen forces that would happily swallow the Klein family whole if given the chance, and a dozen more who would be content to see the Klein family ripped apart. But that wasn't even the worst of it. All of Garrett's efforts to keep them under the radar had been destroyed by his unexpected election to the 10 seats. He knew that the power the family wielded was significant, but he had really been hoping to keep that power out of the limelight. Sighing deeply for what seemed like the millionth time in the last few minutes, he did his best to collect his scattered thoughts and refocus them. In contrast to the fierce storm that battered at the windows, his office was warm, a fire lit in a stone fireplace, filling the room with heat and the comforting smell of pine firewood. As he turned away from the window, Garrett was suddenly struck by how nice his office looked. Henrik, the original owner of the inn, had paid little attention to the decor. But since inheriting it after Henrik had been possessed and eliminated, Garrett had slowly begun to update the furniture. His desk was a beautiful dark wood, with carved 5-petaled flower motifs that matched the ornamentation on his wheelchair. The chairs for his guests had been updated, from simple hard wooden chairs to more comfortable wing-back chairs. A crude set of shelves that had stood along one of the walls had been converted into built-ins that ran the length of the room. A few paintings had been added, as well as a glass case that displayed a number of oddities. By far the most impressive item was a massive mirror that hung opposite Garrett's desk, reflecting the light from the lamps placed around the room. The mirror's frame, originally a carved motif showing a woman combing her hair, had been transformed under Isabel's control and now consisted of carved flowers and vines. This mirror was a gateway to the hollow space, a maze-like collection of rooms and hall was inhabited by Isabel, Garrett's dire spirit guardian, and the pale fiends she had collected. It also served as the hidden base for Delrissa the Bone Witch, the new leader of the remnants of the Dark Hand, necromancers who, until a week ago, had threatened the very existence of the city. Once his enemy's strongest follower, Delrissa had been freed from Agmayoth's domination, and had chosen to commit herself instead to Garrett. Using a small hand mirror, Delrissa and the necromancers who followed her could enter the liminal space inside of the mirror, using it as a way to hide from the sight of the world. On a small pedestal next to the fireplace rested a simple red mask with a 5-colored flower covering the left eye. When he caught sight of it, Garrett couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. This was Viper's mask, worn by Garrett's first guardian until he had fallen in the battle against Agmayoth. The guardian flower he had carried had transferred itself to Sinan of the Grave Walker gang, transforming the already powerful Shaper ranked awakened into Garrett's guardian, and the wielder of Lasvik's flame, a terrifying fire that could both consume and generate life force. Though he could have given the red mask to Sinon, Garrett preferred to have his guardian operate in the light, drawing attention away from himself and providing him with more direct support. No, the mask would have to wait until he had a third guardian seed. Hearing someone clear their throat, Garrett stopped his idle musing and turned his attention to Rin, who, as usual, sat on his desk, watching him with a curious expression. "Sorry, I was distracted for a moment." "What were you saying?" Garrett asked, coughing lightly into his hand and attempting to smile. Rin's expression showed some of the concern that she felt, but she didn't voice it, instead continuing with the topic they had been discussing. "The workers have already been deployed to Paro's factory, but they're starting to report trouble with the foreman that Paro has in place. He's being quite disruptive." Closing his eyes as he considered the situation, Garrett slowly nodded. "That's to be expected. Please tell them to bear with it. I know that it's frustrating, but they just need to endure for a couple of weeks. As soon as our production facilities are back to work, we can move them as well." "All right, I'll tell them, but they are not going to be happy about it. You can remind them that even 10 years is not too long for a gentleman to get his revenge. Or a lady, for that matter. Paro is in the process of digging his own grave, and that foreman is his shovel. All we need to do is get out of the way." Hopping down from the desk, Rin flashed a smile at Garrett and stretched her arms. "That's good to hear, 'cause I don't like him at all," she said, before her expression grew serious. "You need to take care of yourself, though. I can tell you're getting tired, and you've been burning the candle at both ends. Francis says you're not eating either, which isn't good for you. Your body needs as much nutrition as possible." Putting on a meek expression, Garrett nodded. "I'll pay attention to my health, I promise." "See that you do. If you collapse, the Klein family is doomed." With another long look that Garrett didn't quite know how to read, Rin turned and sauntered out the door, leaving Garrett alone in his office. Letting out a small sigh, Garrett turned to go to his desk, catching sight of himself in the large mirror hanging over the fireplace. He had always possessed pale skin and delicate, aristocratic features. However, he had to admit there was a certain gauntness about his appearance that was somewhat alarming. Ever since he had absorbed Lasvik's flame, a faintly skeletal quality had emerged in his already thin body. Shaking his head, he wheeled himself to the desk and retrieved a thin book from one of his drawers. As he flipped it open, he pulled up his status, still unable to believe just how much he had grown. Status. Name, Garrett Klein. Path, Dream Ruler. Subpath, Dream Gardener, Path of the Watcher. Level, 6. Exp, 335 640ths. Abilities. 9/10 Whisper of the Dream 1 Observe the Dream 3 Dream Seed 5 Dreamer's Cloak 1 Beautiful Bewitchment 3 Spirit-Sucking Thorns 1 Illusory Dream 2 Life and Death Bloom 1 Skeletal Crown 1 His abilities had expanded, reaching 9 out of the 10 maximum abilities he could possess. He was already at level 6, and in addition to his Dream Ruler path, he had 2 subpaths. One was related to the growth of the dream flowers that even now surrounded him, their ethereal forms invisible in the waking world. Then there was his original path, the Path of the Watcher, a path that he was beginning to discover held tremendous power at the higher levels. Over the last few days, he had been receiving a steady trickle of experience points, even as he had spent a considerable number of experience points on replanting the dream flowers that had fallen during the battle against Agmayoth. Focusing on his new primary path, Dream Ruler, Garrett pulled up the details, marveling at the changes this path had wrought in him. Dream Ruler. You have subdued multiple dream locations, bringing them under your control, and integrating their powers and forces into your territory. As you continue to grow your territory, you will improve the natural abilities granted by this class. Each territory increases the effect of existing abilities, while potentially granting new abilities. Territories. 2. Ruler's Aura. Your soul spark exerts a field of authority that causes those around you to obey. The strength of this aura is determined by the number of territories you control. Anoint chosen, grant special individuals your blessing to act on your behalf, lending them a portion of your power. You may have a number of chosen equal to the number of territories you possess. Awaken the soul. Dreamer's Rest. Mortals who visit Dreamer's Rest are more likely to awaken. Flame of Life and Death. First tomb, you have subdued Lasrik's flame. Survivability, high. Growth potential, unknown. In addition to granting him 4 new abilities, each with tremendous potential, becoming a dream ruler had fundamentally changed the way Garrett interacted with the dream. Though it was daytime, he could feel the dream even now. There seemed to be a veil across it, blocking his direct access, but Garrett could still sense its presence everywhere around him. He was learning more and more about how the dream and the waking world interacted, and had begun to wonder if, as he grew more powerful, he would be able to pierce that veil, accessing the dream in the daytime as well as at night. He currently had control of 2 territories, the first being the inn in which he sat, and the second, the first tomb, deep under the crypts in the northern part of the city. Both of them exerted influence on the dream around them, and the stronger Garrett grew, the greater the area of their influence. This was both a boon and a danger. The boon came in the form of more territory being brought under Garrett's control. Previously, it had been necessary for the dream flowers to propagate out into the dream in order for Garrett to be able to sense what was happening in a given area. Now, Garrett could feel a sense of connection with the streets outside of the Dreamer's Inn. Likewise, he felt the same connection with the deep tunnels and crypts above the first tomb. It wasn't as if he would immediately know what was happening in those spaces, or even that he could directly control them. Instead, he could feel those areas of the dream feeding him mental energy, reinforcing his already prodigious power. This, he realized, was one of the main reasons that Agmayath's mental energy had been so overwhelming. When Garrett had gone up against him, he had not just been dealing with the mental energy of a powerful opponent, but instead had been fighting against the reinforcement of a large area of the dream. There was still much for Garrett to explore and discover in regards to his new Dream Ruler path, but the one thing that Garrett did know was that along with the power the Dream Ruler path brought to him, there were planted seeds of danger that, if not properly handled, would undoubtedly prove his undoing. The territory that Garrett controlled was constantly growing, though at an incredibly slow rate. Still, with enough time, it would eventually expand into territory controlled by other dream rulers. And when that happened, Garrett knew that the conflict would not resolve peacefully. He wasn't sure why, but the idea was fixed firmly in his heart. Dream rulers could not coexist in the same territory, and once their territories did begin to encroach, a ruler's war was inevitable. Feeling like he had inherited a ticking time bomb, Garrett shook his head and scrolled through the rest of his abilities. Whisper of the Dream. You have gained the ability to communicate with those who can walk the dream. Skill level 1. Observe the Dream. You have gained the ability to see the dream clearly. The energy cost of activating this ability has been reduced. You may now use your other abilities while using Observe the Dream. Skill level 3. Dream Seed. You have seized one of Crimson Eye of Shemorith's abilities, Dream Seed. 1 exp. Observation Seed. 2 exp. Communication Seed. 3 exp. Loyalty Seed. 6 exp. Guardian Seed. 2 halves. 10 exp. Overmind Seed. You can now plant seeds anywhere in the dream and nourish them yourself. You can now set your dream flowers to the following states: Defend. Default. Dream flowers will actively protect their hosts, or locations, from nightmares. Hunt. Dream flowers will release spores to attract nightmares with the intent of consuming them. Growth. Dream flowers will absorb the mental energy of their host or any creature that enters their location with the intent of growing stronger. Your seeds now propagate naturally, so long as they have a steady source of mental energy. Skill level 5. Dream Cloak. You have gained the ability to use the dream to cloak your presence, reducing the likelihood that you will be seen. Skill level 1. Guide Growth. Beautiful Bewitchment. Your dream flowers grow, guided by your will to become objects of supernatural beauty. Those who look upon them cannot help but become enthralled. Modify Dream Seed. Increase the bewitchment ability of dream flowers, strengthening your influence on hosts. Increase the bewitchment ability of dream flowers against nightmares. Modify dream flowers. Clusters of dream flowers will now produce a bewitching scent that will have one of the following effects. Distract. Affected targets will grow distracted and forget what they were doing until the effect wears off. Enthrall. Affected targets will grow enthralled and peacefully admire the flowers until the effect wears off. Enrage. Affected targets will grow enraged and attack anyone around them until the effect wears off. Skill Level 3. Guide Growth. Spirit-sucking thorns. Your dream flowers grow, guided by your will to become fearsome predators, hiding sharp thorns under their beautiful petals. Modify Dream Seed. Increase the attack strength of dream flowers by improving their ability to consume the mental energy of their hosts and enemies. Skill Level 1. Illusory Dream. You have gained the ability to use the dream to create illusions, confusing both dreamers and nightmares. Your illusions grow more realistic, gaining a physical component. Skill Level 2. Guide Growth. Death Flame Bloom. Your dream flowers grow, guided by your will to hold Lusric's flame. Modify Dream Seed. Your flowers have melded with the powerful dream fire, Lusric's flame, becoming immune to its effects. Skill Level 1. Skeletal Crown. The power of Lusric flows through you, granting you natural control over undead. Your mental strength produces a suppressive effect on undead you encounter, causing them to instinctively avoid attacking you. Skill Level 1. His highest level ability, Dream Seed, formed the foundation of his power, and the 3 guide growth abilities he had added transformed the relatively benign dream flowers into a terrifying force. He didn't have any particular love for the undead, and if it had been possible, would have been happy to swap them out for practically anything else, but he also wasn't one to reject a tool he could use to keep himself and the other members of the family safe. He was just reflecting on whether or not he should actively try to expand his forces in the crypts below the city, when he heard the sound of a quiet footstep in the hall outside. Whoever was walking there was trying to move slowly, and it took but a thought for Garrett to see who it was. Clenching his teeth, he took a deep breath, stabilizing his emotions, and wiping the frustration from his heart. He carefully closed the book he had been about to read, and slipped it back into the desk drawer. Of all the problems that plagued him, the one about to enter the room was the most thorny. The doorknob turned slowly, and a moment later, Princess Eloise, the last remaining survivor of the royal family, poked her head into the room. "Garrett, are you busy?" Stifling the sharp words that rose to his lips, Garrett did his best to smile. "Of course not, Your Highness. Please come in." Chapter 2. Opening the door, Princess Eloise walked into the room, her guard behind her. From what Garrett had gathered, his name was Morris, a high-ranked lighting stage awakened, quite close to becoming a shaper. He was normally quiet, but Garrett had noticed a fair amount of derision in the man's eyes every time his cold gaze swept past him. Morris moved with a faint disregard that spoke of a noble birth, and he stayed close to Princess Eloise at all times. Garrett didn't remember him from the palace, which meant that he had likely been one of the royal family's secret guards, planted outside of the city to be used in time of need. With Princess Eloise wanting to make a comeback and fight her uncle for the throne, now was Morris's time to shine. Though, if Garrett had to make a bet on how all of this was going to end up, it was much more likely that Morris would end up dead in a gutter somewhere, his throat slit. The princess had spent the night at the inn, refusing Garrett's offer to send her directly to Baron Galavin's house, and instead expressing that she felt more comfortable staying with him. That put Garrett on guard, and now, as he watched her take her seat across from him, he could sense that whatever it was on her mind that she wanted from him was about to be expressed. Morris took position behind her, his arms crossed over his chest as he stared with what he assumed was an intimidating gaze at Garrett, who did his very best to look suitably frightened. He clearly succeeded in his attempt, as Princess Eloise turned and shot a frown at her guard, causing him to ease his expression a bit. Turning back to Garrett with a smile, Princess Eloise clasped her hands in her lap and blinked her large, expressive eyes innocently at him. "It feels like it's been a lifetime since I last talked to you," Princess Eloise said. Her voice was soft and sweet, but Garrett wasn't fooled one bit. He had no idea what had happened to the princess in the last 6 months, but there was an edge of steel hidden under her velvety tones, and he could feel her lighting stage mental power infusing every single word she spoke. To Garrett, who specialized in the manipulation of mental power, her attempts to make her words more winsome were child's play. But for the sake of getting rid of this trouble as soon as possible, he played along. Much has happened in the last half a year, Your Highness. Please call me Aloys, Garrett, otherwise I won't feel comfortable. Even as the princess earnestly expressed herself, Morris' glare turned back on, as he silently warned Garrett not to even dare calling the princess by her first name alone. Flashing an apologetic smile, Garrett shook his head. I'm sorry, Your Highness. As one of your subjects, I don't think I can do that. The princess looked disappointed, but pushed past it. Do you still really consider yourself one of my subjects? She asked, her voice growing quieter. Of course, Your Highness, Garrett replied with an earnest expression. The laws of Insomnium are quite clear, and even the Duke knows it. After all, he's declared himself regent, not king. Clearly, he's also aware that your father's line has not yet ended, and the throne is yours by right. Though Garrett's expression was warm, his words were cold and factual, causing the princess to feel a slight disquiet growing in her heart. I understand that, she said after thinking over Garrett's words for a moment. But my uncle seems quite content to remain in power. I don't want to think bad of him, of course, but he has not once reached out to try and find me. It could just be that he is busy stabilizing the situation in the city. After all, we've had quite a few challenges in the last 6 months. There has been incredible turmoil following the attack on the palace, and martial law has only recently been lifted. There's still a curfew in place. Then add to that a repeat of the Night of the Dead, or as it's more accurately called, the March of Lysric, that has completely disrupted this district. As the regent, the Duke has no doubt been completely focused on stabilizing the situation in the city. After all, Garrett paused for only the briefest of moments as his eyes flickered to Morris before returning to the princess. There are a significant number of factions interested in the power vacuum. All of them have been jockeying for a position, and it's only been due to the regent's iron grip control over the city that things haven't gotten much worse. The longer Garrett spoke, the greater the pout on Princess Aloys's face grew. When he finally fell silent, she looked at him with eyes that seemed to express hurt. It almost sounds like you're on his side, Princess Aloys said. Here I was hoping that you would support me. Feigning surprise, Garrett leaned forward slightly. Your Highness, I do support you. But I wasn't aware that supporting you automatically put me at odds with the regent. The two of you are family. Surely you are not enemies. Garrett's eyes suddenly widened as if a thought had struck him and he took a sharp breath. Unless you believe. Trailing off he stared at Princess Aloys, the meaning of his unsaid words exceptionally clear. Panic flashed through Princess Aloys's expression, only to be suppressed a moment later as she smiled sweetly and shook her head. Of course not. Such an idea is silly. Quickly she tried to find another subject, turning the conversation away. After a glance around the room, she gestured to the stack of books stacked high on the edge of Garrett's desk. It seems that you've done quite well for yourself here. I'm told that you're running a profitable business and have some connections to the underworld, is that correct? Everybody in this district has connections to the underworld, Your Highness. I'm nothing special in that regard. After all, we're far from the palace, and the nobles don't deign to grace us with their presence very often, Garrett said, sounding rueful, as if he was chagrined to have been cast out of the circles of nobility he used to have access to. And I get by. For someone in my position. He glanced at his waist and held up what remained of his right arm. The best I can do is use my mind. As money counters are in short supply, I've found a place among the people. But not just found a place, the princess said, measuring Garrett with her gaze. The Klein family's exploits are considerable, and have spread quite far, reaching the ears of many in Port Reverie, across the swamp. There are many whispers that your strength is not to be underestimated. All smoke and mirrors, Garrett said, with what might have been his first genuine smile since he had seen the princess. It was gone a moment later, though, replaced with a humble expression as he bowed his head. I may look like I have been successful, but the reality is that power is in the hands of others. We're a sad excuse for a gang, but we have the fortune to be under the Grave Walkers, an organization of considerable repute in this part of the city. My responsibilities are primarily financial, ensuring that their businesses run smoothly. While it would be wonderful to be able to claim that the family's growth has been all my doing, there have been many hands involved in making it flourish. And at the end of the day, I find that power often lies outside of my grasp. Sighing, Princess Eloise nodded, as if agreeing with Garrett. That is often the way of it, she said. But my hope is to change that, and I would like to invite you to join me. Join you? Garrett asked, his forehead furrowing. Join you where? From the way her fingers clenched, Garrett could tell that the princess was suppressing her annoyance, but she still smiled sweetly. I have returned to the city, and I intend to take my throne back. With a rustle of skirts, she stood, walking around the desk, to the office's window, that stared out at the street in front of the inn. Garrett turned his wheelchair to keep his eye on her, waiting silently until she spoke once more. That day, in the palace, Princess Eloise said, her voice quiet, I felt as if my entire world had been destroyed. Everything I knew came crashing down around me. It was only the brave sacrifice of our attendants that allowed me to escape. The cost was too great, however. A cost that you know all too well. Part of me wishes to run, to change my name, to become someone new so I might leave this trouble behind forever. But every time I sleep, I see the faces of those who laid down their lives to protect mine. I know that I cannot let this matter stand. Justice must be served. In order to do that, I must sit on the throne. I want to invite you to join me, to help me reclaim the position that is rightfully mine. Do so, and you will be rewarded with whatever your heart desires. Garrett didn't respond immediately. Princess Eloise didn't press him. She continued to stare out of the window as she waited for him to consider her words, and after close to a minute of silence, he finally spoke. Princess Eloise. This was the first time that Garrett had called her something other than Your Highness or Your Majesty. As the princess turned to look at him, it was with a hopeful expression. What she saw caused her breath to catch. Garrett was looking at her with absolute calm, his eyes radiating a faint sense of pressure that made her heart skip a beat. Blinking, she suddenly found that his expression was no different than it had been before, causing her to wonder what it was that she had imagined. I have already expressed that I am in full support of your retaking of your rightful throne. However, I wonder if you know what it is you ask. By hard work and a considerable amount of luck, I have managed to carve out a place for myself here, in this community, among the commoners. You are asking me to step into a world that is hard enough to navigate without the major disadvantages I currently possess. If I'm honest, I find the thought of such a thing troublesome. Here, people only care if I'm useful, and they don't talk behind my back. He didn't even need to mention it for the princess to know that wouldn't be the case if he were to try and return to the noble circles. As much as she hated to admit it, the princess wasn't naive enough to believe that Garrett was wrong. She knew full well how nasty the noble circles were, and how any weakness would swiftly be weaponized by one's enemies. Still, she needed as many allies in the city as she could get, especially allies she could trust. The young man in front of her had been her older brother's closest confidant, and time had proven that even with major disadvantages, he had been able to create space for himself in the tumultuous power struggle that covered every part of this city. Racking her brain for a way to convince him, the princess couldn't help but feel a sense of relief when Garrett sighed and nodded his head. Though I don't know that I'll be able to do much good, and in fact may become a liability, I'm willing to support you. Tell me what you need me to do. Smiling graciously to hide the elation in her heart, Princess Eloise clasped her hands to her chest as she smiled at Garrett. Thank you, Garrett. It really means the world to me that you're willing to do this. It was all that Garrett could do to avoid rolling his eyes. Sometimes he felt he preferred the brutally bloody combat of the underworld to the fake social niceties of the upper class. Princess Eloise returned to her seat, and they began to talk of what she was actually hoping to accomplish. "I know there are still supporters in the city," she said, her voice losing a bit of the sweetness that had marked it when she first arrived. "The one organizing them is Baron Galavin. He's the one who arranged for me to come into the city. I'm familiar with his son, Thomas," Garrett said. "Wonderful," the princess exclaimed. "That means you can provide an introduction for me. You see, I've never actually met the Baron or his son, and it would be good to start getting to know them. I also need to make contact with information brokers who can help me understand what's currently going on in the palace, as I will need to understand what my uncle is thinking before I appear." As he listened to Princess Eloise explain her plans, Garrett found himself curious. While the princess had always been sharp, she hadn't had the clear level of strategic thinking that she displayed now. And for a brief moment, Garrett wondered if she was like him, a being from another world thrust into this one. Of course, it was always possible that she simply had good teachers or had been hiding her ambition while she was in the palace. After talking for a while, they agreed that Garrett would set up a meeting with the Baron and his son to take place at some point in the next few days. The princess wanted to meet sooner, but Garrett carefully explained that there was some unavoidable business that he had to participate in. He did it without ever mentioning exactly what the business was, and after he rather obviously avoided a couple of the princess's inquiries, she let the matter drop, thanked him for his support, assured him that once she rose to power, he would be rewarded generously, and left the room, her guard, Morris, trailing after her. As soon as the door closed behind them, Garrett reached up and rubbed his forehead, an annoyed expression flashing across his face. As if he didn't have enough to deal with already, between the gangs, the fight between the merchants, military, and exorcists, and continuing to explore the dream, he was now completely enmeshed in whatever political fight would happen in the next few months. Closing his eyes, he began to organize his contingency plans, wanting to ensure that he had all his bases covered, and could retreat if necessary. From what he understood, it wasn't possible to move the Dreamer's throne, which would mean that retreat would only happen when all other options were exhausted. The biggest thing was that as soon as he stepped out of this district, much of his strength would be gone. While the flower ghouls were continuing to expand in the crypts under this part of the city, and even into the sewer system beyond it, they were completely confined to the eastern part of this district. The large river that ran through the center of Insomnium formed a significant barrier, preventing Garrett from being able to push his control to the south and east. Chapter 3 The palace was on the exact opposite side of the city from where Garrett was now, the furthest from his power base that it possibly could be, while still remaining in the city. Even worse, Garrett knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that there were great rulers in between him and the palace, which meant that if he wanted to expand his powers in that direction, he would be forced into multiple rulers' wars, something he desperately wanted to avoid. Thankfully, sending his people into the areas around another great ruler's territory wouldn't trigger the war automatically. It was only when they entered the specific territory itself that the war would begin. So long as Garrett could identify those territories ahead of time, there was a chance that he could navigate between them without starting a fight. Considering, however, what Agmayath had said about the other rulers and their madness, Garrett wasn't holding out hope. In fact, he fully expected that as soon as he came to another great ruler's notice, he would be attacked. And that the fact that the Klein family barely qualified as a player in the vicious game of politics that plagued the city, and Garrett fully expected that he'd be spending the next 6 months fighting off not only the illusory threats of great rulers in the dream, but very real and physical threats from the factions that controlled the waking world. He felt as if he had stepped into a nest of vipers, many of whom were starting to lift their heads to stare at him. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the worry out of his mind. None of this would matter, of course, if he didn't pass the next hurdle that stood directly in front of him. That afternoon, they would leave for the underground arena, and that night, the challenges to the Klein family would take place. Carefully, he reviewed what he already knew. The two challengers, the Ebony Association, led by Jero Twinblade, and the Marble Griffins, led by the former general, Vent Deland, would be bringing teams to challenge. According to what Deland had said at the meeting, His only interest in challenging was making sure that the Klein family was up to snuff. Meanwhile, Jero Twinblade wanted to claim the seat for her own sub-guild, the Dark Blade Collective. Garrett had spent a considerable amount of time considering whether or not it would be wiser to just barely lose the challenge. At the same time, holding a seat with the Klein family itself would be extremely beneficial, as Sinan already held one. Though it wouldn't be possible to completely control the 10 seats with just his and Sinan's, it was a start. A vague plan had begun to form in Garrett's mind as he thought about how to approach the city's underworld. The main thing was coming to an understanding with the 5-seat holders on this side of the river. Garrett was wary about the other side of the river, as it was largely controlled by the nobility. But north of the river, that influence waned, and the biggest player in the room was undoubtedly the Adventurers Guild. Arthur Telson of the Adventurers Guild had been one of the first to endorse Garrett. On the surface at least, the relationship between the Klein family and the Hunters group was amiable. Henry Yannis, the leader of Yannis Manor, which lay just south of Dreamer'S Inn on an island in the middle of the river, had also expressed his interest in forming at least a rough alliance with the Klein family. This left only the Ebony Association to the east as a challenger to the Klein family's rise. As he thought through his plan, Garrett's gaze turned cold. He had nothing against Jero or the Ebony Association, and he fully supported everyone's rights to fight for their own place in the world. He did, however, have a hard line. If she or any of her subordinate gangs were to cross that line, the consequences would be swift, severe, and final. Shortly after lunch, Rin came to fetch Garrett, helping him push his wheelchair out into the inn's great room. There, they found Abius, Ob, and Maximus waiting for them. Lef, Helger, and Gavin were all at a table nearby, and they stood up as well when they saw Garrett enter the room. "Is everything ready?" Garrett asked. Abius nodded, twitching aside the edge of his cloak to show the weapons stowed underneath. After careful consideration, Garrett had decided on a team that would reveal some of the Klein family's strengths without revealing everything. Sinan would participate, forming the main core of the team's strength, while Abius would support her. Maximus was joining the team as a frontline fighter, while Ob was going to represent them as a striker. That left one remaining slot, and after careful consideration, Garrett called one of the 3 remaining red-masked assassins to join them. His hope was that this team would adequately demonstrate the family's strength without revealing too many of their hidden cards. Most of the gangs in the city had 1 or maybe 2 members at the Shaper level, while Garrett, in theory, could have fielded an almost complete team of Shapers. Between him, Sinan, Delrissa the Bone Witch, and Isabel, they had 4 Shapers, and had Viper still been alive, they would have had 5. Revealing such a force, however, was a recipe for disaster, as it would have made them the enemy of every single organization in the city. Still, just knowing that he could call upon such forces if necessary, caused Garrett a great deal of relief. With the addition of the necromancers that Delrissa had forcefully recruited, along with the mercenaries from the Cleaver's Edge group, the Klein family had a veritable army of lighting level awakened. Garrett was slowly gaining the confidence that he could go toe-to-toe with any force in the city. He didn't let it get to his head, however, as he knew there were undoubtedly threats still hidden from him. The more powerful he had grown personally, the more firm had become his belief that there was a manifesting stage awakened in the city, maybe more than one. While the Shaper level was powerful, it still lacked the ability to completely dominate everyone below it, and didn't quite carry the same suppressive aura that Garrett had felt around the old king. If his suspicions were right, and the now-dead monarch had been in the manifesting stage, then it meant that whoever killed him was likely in the same stage. Just because he had hidden himself well, Garrett didn't grow conceited. What he could do, others could do also, and each of his successes made him slightly more paranoid about what his enemies might be cooking up. With everyone gathered, the group set out, heading down into the building's basement, before entering the tunnel system that lay underneath. As they carefully maneuvered through the sewers, moving toward the underground, where the challenge match would be held, Garrett felt a faint flicker of mental energy behind them. Lifting his hand, he had the group pause, at the same time using his own mental energy to shield them, ensuring that whoever was behind them would lose track of where they were. He heard a faint exclamation, and then the sound of hurrying. A moment later, two figures stepped around the corner, freezing in shock when they saw the Klein family team staring at them. Both figures wore robes that Garrett, as well as everyone else, recognized immediately. For a moment, the two sides stared at each other, and then, taking a deep breath to calm his emotions, Garrett gestured with his left hand to Princess Eloise. "Your Highness, may I ask you what you're doing?" A faint blush rose on the princess's cheeks, but she responded in as calm a tone as she could muster. "I was hurrying to catch up with you, of course." Hesitating for only a moment, she walked over to where Garrett sat, Morris trailing her closely. When she arrived next to Garrett, she found the young lady behind him staring at her coldly. The princess wasn't used to such looks, and for a moment, considered having Morris slap the young woman, but quickly changed her mind when she saw the look Garrett was giving her. "You're headed to the underground arena, right?" the princess said. "For the 10-seat challenge?" Garrett had never mentioned anything of the sort to her, but it made sense to him that Princess Eloise would have her own ways of gathering information, and while he was curious who had sold him out, that would have to wait for another time. "We are," Garrett said evenly, "so I'm afraid we are not going to be able to entertain you this evening." "Oh, that's okay. You can just take me with you," Princess Eloise said, beaming at Garrett. "That will be difficult." "Oh, I'm not expecting you to treat me like a princess while we're there," the princess said, covering her mouth as she giggled. "We'll treat it as an adventure. I'll go incognito as one of your," she glanced at Rin, "maids. Nobody will even know who I am." To her surprise, Rin didn't bristle at all when she was called a maid, though a couple of the others who were with Garrett did. Rubbing his forehead with his fingers, as if he had a headache coming, Garrett turned the princess down. "My apologies, Your Majesty. I don't think it's safe. I'm afraid that our meager strength won't be able to protect you if something goes wrong. And in an event like this, it's always possible for something to go wrong." "You don't have to worry about Her Majesty's safety," Morris said, his tone disdainful. "I'll be more than enough." Garrett didn't respond, pretending he hadn't even heard the man speak as he continued to stare calmly at the princess. That angered Morris, but before he could step forward, Princess Eloise held up her hand. "I'm not relying on you for protection," she said, "and if something does happen, you won't be responsible for me." This had been exactly what Garrett was waiting for, and with a gracious smile, he dipped his head. "In that case, Your Highness, it would be our pleasure to have you come along." Princess Eloise and Garrett exchanged insincere smiles before the group began to move again, bringing Princess Eloise and her guard along with them. Sinon was waiting for them at the entrance to the underground arena. After meeting up with her and a few of her men, they entered and began to make their way toward the center platform. Along the way, Garrett detected more than a few gazes sent their direction. He ignored them, and it wasn't long before they arrived at the last ramp that led up to the 10 seats. The two trolls were conspicuously absent, as Garrett and Sinon had both proven themselves unaffected by such petty tricks the last time they were here. Princess Eloise, who had been looking around with considerable interest, spotted a few of the other gang leaders who were gathered together waiting for them. She began to pester Garrett with whispered questions about who everyone was. He did his best to explain until he saw Vent Deland heading their direction. As a former general, Vent had been in and out of the palace many times and had been on a practically first-name basis with most of the royal family. Fearing she would be recognized, Princess Eloise pulled her hood down and stepped behind Garrett, pretending to be one of his attendants. This made her guard, Morris, quite uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything as Deland stopped in front of Garrett. The old soldier was wearing armor, as were all of his men. He looked down at Garrett for a moment, and then his gaze rose to Sinon, who still wore the thick strip of black cloth across her eyes. "Are the two of you ready?" he asked. "We are," Sinon responded. "You look like you're getting ready for a fight yourself. Are you planning on participating in this challenge?" With a grim smile, Deland nodded. "As soon as you decided to, "I didn't have a choice," he said, "as only a shaper can face another shaper. So long as you're part of the challenge, I will be too." Garrett hadn't anticipated anything of the sort, and for a moment he thought about having Sinon step down. Just then, there was a commotion, and many of the people who had gathered around began to back up, as Jero Twin Blade and the members of her gang stalked towards Garrett and the others. They had come dressed for war, and the murderous aura that surrounded them was palpable. Garrett clearly wasn't the only one who felt it, as Deland frowned and turned to look at Jero. She held up her hand, forestalling whatever he was about to say, as she spoke to Garrett. "The Brass Tigers were an ally of ours," she said, "and I have strong reason to believe that you and the Grave Walkers conspired to kill them." "Don't spout unfounded accusations," Sinon said, stepping forward. "The only person here strong enough to kill Pascal is you and Rackham," Jero spat. With an amused smile, Sinon shook her head. "I'm not in the habit of snapping my opponent's necks," she replied. As she spoke, she lifted her hand, and a small tongue of green flame danced across her fingertips. "If I had done it, I would have burned the entire place to the ground, and you wouldn't have found anything but ash." Not backing down one bit, Jero just sneered. "You can deny it all you want," she said, "but I know the truth." Without another word, she spun on her heel and led her men away, heading towards the arena that gave the underground arena its name. Deland looked after her, still frowning. In his view, Jero's behavior was unsightly, leaving a bad taste in his mouth, and making him wonder if he should withdraw from this whole matter. Seeing that Jero had left, Henry Janus strolled over, a laconic smile on his thin face. "Don't let her get to you," he said to Garrett and Sinon. "She's just terrified that she's going to be cut off from the rest of the city." It took a moment for Garrett to understand what Janus was saying, but then his brain caught up, and he nodded. "That's right. If I win this seat, the Ebony Association is going to be completely isolated in the eastern corner of the city. She'll have the Grave Walkers to the northwest, the Klein family to the west, and Janus Manor to the southwest." "Exactly," Henry said, "and she doesn't get along with any of us. That's why she had signed an agreement with the Brass Tigers, after all, to put pressure on the Grave Walkers from both sides so that they couldn't squeeze her out." Chapter 4. Henry's insight caused Garrett to feel as if another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Quickly reviewing everything he knew about the Ebony Association, Garrett realized that he had inadvertently forced Jero into a corner. The Ebony Association was made up of adventuring teams that primarily worked in the swamp, maintaining the official trade routes between Insomnium and some of the other cities connected by the waterway. They were one of the city's main suppliers of monster material as well, harvesting all sorts of rare and hard-to-find goods from the swamp, and then bringing them into the city to sell. That hadn't been a problem, as there had been a gap between the Grave Walkers' territory and Janus Manor's territory, giving them an easy route to take their goods to the markets in the center of the district. Those routes had now been eliminated, as the Klein family had absorbed all of the smaller gangs that controlled those streets. Had the Klein family simply remained the Grave Walker gang subordinate, it wouldn't have mattered, as Jero and her forces could have simply ignored them. But because Garrett was being pushed into taking one of the 10 seats, that put his gang on the same level as the Ebony Association, which would force Jero to negotiate with him if she wanted to continue moving goods through his territory. It was no wonder that Jero was taking this fight seriously. Henry, seeing that his words had been properly understood, gave Sinon a nod, and then wandered off to find a seat, looking forward to watching the challenge. The first fight quickly approached, so Sinon led the way, Garrett following behind her as their team headed into the arena. It was a massive stone building, with enough seats for thousands of people. The arena stretched in an oval around a large sandy pit where the fights would take place. There were seats already reserved for them at the edge of the arena, and Ren pushed Garrett's wheelchair up to one of the seats, while Sinon led the rest of the team down into the arena. The challenge was simple. A gang that wanted to maintain its seat had to persist against each challenger team in turn. Their first opponent was Deland of the Marble Griffins, along with 4 of his men. They entered the arena, across from where Sinon and the others stood. Though Deland had clearly stated that his only interest was in making sure the Klein family was up to scratch, Garrett was still wary, and told Sinan not to let down her guard. Hearing someone call his name, Garrett glanced up, and saw Thomas Glavin walking towards him with a wide smile. "Are you excited to assume your seat at the table?" the young nobleman asked, laughing when Garrett rolled his eyes. "I'd be much more excited if we didn't have to go through this farce," Garrett said. "You and me both," Thomas chuckled, patting Garrett on the shoulder. "We have much more important things to do, don't we? Speaking of which, I'm quite looking forward to meeting your special guest." Leaning down next to Garrett, Thomas lowered his voice. "Believe me when I say my father is just as excited." Glancing down, he saw Garrett's eyes shift, as if pointing towards something. Thomas looked over and saw a robed young woman sitting next to Garrett. Though he couldn't see her face, Thomas was sharp enough to pick up what Garrett was indicating, realizing that the person he had just been speaking of was sitting next to Garrett. His expression stiffened slightly, and the hand he had on Garrett's shoulder twitched. His recovery was swift, however, and he waved to one of his attendants. "Bring me a chair," he said. "I'm going to sit next to Garrett." Ren, who was sitting on the other side of the princess, heard Garrett's silent command and quickly stood up. Bowing slightly to Thomas, Ren said, "Sir, you're welcome to take my seat." "Oh, that's perfect," Thomas said, giving her a grateful smile. Seemingly oblivious to the hard stare Morris was giving him, Thomas took Ren's seat while she went to stand behind Garrett. Sitting down, he casually greeted Princess Eloise, pretending that he didn't have any idea who she was. His acting was so good that the princess actually fell for it, and with considerable delight, introduced herself as Mary. It didn't take long for Thomas to engage her in conversation, and as the two of them chatted happily, Garrett returned his attention to the arena, where the first challenge was about to take place. Maximus stood on Sinan's right, his large shield covering her side, while Ob stood on the other side, his large mace resting on his shoulder. Abias stood behind the three of them, his crossbow held loosely in front of him, while the red-masked assassin stood unmoving next to him. Deland, who had donned a helmet, strode towards them, his foreman trailing close behind. Each one held a small shield on their left hand, carried a javelin in their right, and had a sheathed sword at their waist. Each was dressed in splint mail that clanged as they walked, filling the air with quite a bit of sound. Better than any bell, the ringing of their armor caused the arena to quiet down, as everyone stared at the two teams getting ready to fight. Arthur Telson was overseeing the fight, and he stood up from where he sat at the edge of the arena, lifting his hand as Deland and his men stopped, approximately 100 feet from Sinan and the others. "Welcome to the first challenge," Arthur Telson said, his voice booming effortlessly across the arena. "This fight will continue until one of the leaders surrenders. Other than that, there are no rules. You may begin." As soon as his words rang in the air, the Marble Griffin team charged forward, their shields rising in front of them as they thundered across the arena, sand spraying with every heavy step. Abias responded with a crossbow bolt that glowed with bright light as it tore through the air towards the enemy on the furthest right. At the last moment, the man managed to bring his shield up, but the force of the bolt dented the shield and stopped him in his tracks. Sinan, Abias, and Maximus all advanced, breaking into a light jog as they met the incoming charge. At the same time, the red-masked assassin began to move as well, his body blurring and then vanishing completely. For a moment, those watching him could track his steps across the sandy arena, but then they too faded, causing gasps and glances at Garrett. Everyone knew that the red-masked assassin was a member of the Klein family forces, and seeing him completely vanish sent shivers down their spines. Abias was already shooting a second bolt when the two teams crashed together, unleashing their awakened powers and holding nothing back. Deland was hoping to tie up Sinan by himself, but the blast of flame that she let fly curled around him, even as it forced him back, causing his heart to sink. At the same time, Maximus and Ob teamed up on the remaining soldier. Maximus hit him with a shield charge, causing him to stumble as Ob stepped around Maximus' shield and slammed his mace into the soldier's side. Much of the force was absorbed by the man's armor, but he was quickly overwhelmed by the two fighters working together. The fourth soldier was trying to rush into the fight, but he was forced back once more by Abius Bolt, and a moment later, a terrifying feeling of danger shook his heart, causing him to dive to the side as the red-masked assassin appeared behind him, stabbing toward his kidney with a long dagger. The attack missed, and without a word, the assassin stepped backward, fading from sight once again. They'd only been fighting for a minute, but Deland already knew that his team was outmatched. Sinon was effortlessly fighting against him and two of his soldiers, while the other two soldiers were being double-teamed by their opponents. Though Deland had some tricks of his own, his goal wasn't mutual destruction, and so, after another tense minute of fighting, he jumped back and called a surrender. And not a moment too soon, as one of his soldiers felt the sharp tip of the assassin's steel dagger on his neck. As soon as the fight was over, the assassin retreated, returning to stand quietly next to Abius. Maximus offered a hand to the soldier he and Ob had been fighting, and had just knocked down for the third time. After staring at it for a moment, the soldier swore and grabbed it, letting Maximus help him to his feet. Deland walked over to face Sinon, lifting his helmet to reveal a grudging look of respect. "I genuinely thought you'd be the only one with any ability," he said, as his eyes swept over the other members of her team. "But clearly, each one of you is skilled. It would have been a little bit more fair if you weren't quite so oppressively strong, but as long as you had been able to match me, your team probably would have won anyways. Well done." "Thank you," Sinon said. In the stands, Thomas leaned forward to speak across Princess Eloise to Garrett. "Your forces are quite well trained. It's fairly rare to see awakened who can go up against the Marble Griffins." "I mean, it was 2-on-1, Garrett said. "Hardly a fair fight. Even if it had been completely even, it probably would have ended the same way," Thomas replied, clearly not wanting to let Garrett dodge the compliment. "The real challenge will be the next fight," Garrett replied, his eyes drifting toward Jero and her forces sat. After Sinon was declared the winner, Deland led his men out of the arena, and Sinon was given 2 minutes to gather her team together. After that, Arthur Telson called Jero to the stage. Garrett didn't recognize the other 4 fighters she brought with her, which surprised him. He had thought that she would have given Twinfield Smith of the Dark Blade Collective a chance to prove himself. But it seems that this challenge didn't actually have much to do with the gang that Jero had nominated to take the empty seat. With an ugly expression on her face, Jero stalked into the arena, her 4 fighters trailing behind her. If she won here, then all it would mean is the Klein family wouldn't be eligible to hold one of the seats. While that would temporarily solve her problem of being fenced in and blocked from access to the markets where the Ebony Association sold their goods, it still wouldn't solve the problem in the long term, and it was clear that Jero understood this just as well as anybody else. She was in a rough position, and as she faced off against Sinon and the others, there was an obvious desperation in her glare. Frowning slightly, Garrett took command of Sinon, speaking through her mouth. "We're willing to negotiate if you step down," Sinon said, speaking too quietly for anyone outside of the arena to hear. Her words caused Jero to pause, but then the woman's expression hardened once more. "I have no desire to be under your heel," Jero snarled. "I'd much rather just cut you down." "So be it," Sinon said. As Garrett relinquished control, her covered eyes stared straight at Jero, as if her gaze was burning through the cloth mask and burrowing into Jero's body. Even before Arthur Telson gave the command, Sinon had begun to walk forward, forcing him to hurry up and announce the beginning of the fight. As she did, the aura around her grew stronger and stronger, causing heat to radiate through the arena. Behind her, Maximus and Ob both retreated, joining Abius and the red-masked assassin, who was still visible. All 4 of them watched with tense expressions as Sinon got closer and closer to the enemy. Seeing the Gravewalker Guild leader advancing by herself, a feeling of humiliation washed over Jero. With a furious scream, she drew her swords, causing wind to whip through the arena, spraying sand this way and that. Her team was clearly prepared. They quickly donned masks to keep the sand out of their eyes. At the same time, they spread out, revealing their weapons. Each was armed with a pair of hooks with chains on the end of them that extended to their wrists. It didn't take a genius to figure out what their plan of attack was, but Sinon continued to walk forward slowly, unperturbed. "She's foolish enough to come alone. Take her down," Jero said. Her body suddenly blurred as she dashed backward. As soon as she retreated, the others advanced, sprinting forward to surround Jero on four sides. Once they were in position, their hooks shot out, the sharp ends tearing at Sinon's body as they tried to tie her down. Since Jero relied mainly on speed, her advantage would increase massively if her opponents couldn't move. This would allow her to strike and retreat before they could respond. Sinon, whose eyes were still fixed on Jero, didn't seem to care about the hooks and chains. A wave of fierce flame burst from her body, completely surrounding her. The first chain to reach her rapidly melted, transforming into little more than slag that dripped to the ground at her feet. The second chain followed the fate of the first, and all four of the fighters quickly withdrew their other attacks, not wanting to lose their chains to the flame that ate at the air around her. One of them didn't manage to withdraw his chain fast enough, and without even looking, Sinon suddenly reached out and grabbed it, her fingers locking it in place. A thread of green flame darted along the chains, lighting up each link as it went. A moment later it reached the Ebony Association fighter, revealing a mouth like a giant serpent as it bit the man's hand. He let out a terrible shriek as the flame burned his skin and began to slowly climb up his arm. Shaking himself free of the chain, he fell to the ground, trying to smother the flame while pumping as much of his mental energy into his arm to resist it as he could. Yet the flame continued to burn. No matter how he tried to smother it, it continued to dance on his skin, charring his arm black. The mental energy he used to try and block it was rapidly eaten up, and suddenly the flame jumped to his shoulder. There was a whooshing sound, and his arm flew into the air, to land some distance away. Blood spurted from the wound on his severed arm, as Jero appeared in front of him, her jaw clenched tight. Chapter 5 She knew better than anyone the true danger of Sinon's flames, its ability to corrupt the flesh of anyone it touched, and its ever-burning quality that made it almost impossible to get rid of. What she hadn't counted on was the sheer heat it could produce. Had she been able to tie Sinon down, the fight would have been over easily, but with their plan destroyed before they could even start, it looked like this fight was going to be a loss. She hesitated for just a moment, but that hesitation cost her, as Sinon suddenly leapt forward, green flames shrouding her fists. Swearing, Jero retreated, her blades flashing as she defended against the strikes. She was forced to be extra careful to avoid the licking flames from touching her skin, and for a moment, the two women were a blur as they fought back and forth. The Ebony Association's three other fighters had retreated, dragging their now armless companion with them, and they stood at a distance, watching Sinon and Jero fight back and forth, while occasionally sending glances at Abius Maximus Abi and the assassin, who stood on the opposite side of the arena, also watching the fight. While both teams could have thrown themselves into battle, it was clear that the only thing that would actually affect the outcome of the fight was who won between Sinon and Jero, and within another minute, that became clear as well. Though they were both shapers, Sinon was clearly a level above Jero in terms of strength, and the weight of her fists had begun to crack Jero's famed twin blades. Cursing under her breath, Jero retreated, her hands trembling slightly as she held her two blades in front of her. Sinon watched her retreat, and then, with a smirk, began working forward, with an unhurried gait. "I concede," Jero said, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. Sinon didn't stop, continuing to walk forward until Jero swore loudly and repeated the words, this time loud enough for everybody to hear. Sinon's flames died down as she stared at Jero. "This would have been much easier if you had just chosen to negotiate," she said, and without waiting for a reply, turned and walked back over to where her team stood. Arthur Telson gave Sinon an appraising glance, and then took a deep breath, about to announce the winner. At that moment, one of Jero's men stepped forward and revealed a small box that he had hidden in his coat. As soon as it appeared, a terrifying wave of mental energy raced across the arena, causing everyone to gasp. With trembling hands, The man lifted the box and stabbed his palm onto a spike that protruded from one side. Blood poured out of the wound, running into hundreds of silver grooves on the box, and the lid flicked open, causing an incredibly powerful suction force to appear. Yet the man hadn't targeted Sinon, and instead, it was Garrett who felt himself being pulled forward, along with Princess Eloise. A fierce mental energy tore at him, trying to suck him in, but he used his own mental energy to keep himself pinned in place. The problem was, Princess Eloise didn't have that ability, and her mental energy was ripped apart in an instant, causing her to be yanked through the air toward the box. At the last moment, his hand grabbed onto her arm and his feet hooked onto his wheelchair. Before anyone could react, the two of them were sucked into the box, vanishing before everyone's eyes. A furious roar shook the minds of everyone watching, and a moment later, Sinon arrived in front of the man holding the box. Jero was one step faster than her, however, her blade flickering as she removed the head of her underling. There was a cold satisfaction in her eyes as she glared at Sinon, who had been about to burn the man to a crisp. Without hesitating, Jero lunged for the box, only to be forced back by a wall of flame. Sinon stooped to grab the box, fierce flames pouring out of her body, but what actually gave Jero pause wasn't the clearly enraged woman in front of her, but something else entirely. As a Shaper level awakened, Jero was especially sensitive to mental energy and could often tell when someone looked at her intently. Even as she had lunged for the box, she had felt hundreds and then thousands of gazes settling on her. She had no idea where they were from, though many seemed to be coming from above her head, but each one fixed itself on her as if she was the only thing that existed in the world. The feeling slammed into her with so much force that she nearly screamed as she backed up across the arena. After stooping for the box, Sinon examined it, turning it over in her hands. It was about 6 inches on each side, and was covered in dense lines that gleamed a dull silver. One side had a fierce metal spike that was still bloody from where it had been stabbed into the dead man's palm. Only once she had taken a good look did she turn toward Jero. After the initial surprise of everyone present, things had begun to quiet down, and when Sinon spoke, everyone could hear it clearly. "What is this?" Licking her lips, Jero shrugged. "I'm not sure. I have no idea why one of my men would have done something like that." Not a single person listening believed Jero. However, the man in question was already dead, and the others who had been with her had distanced themselves in complete shock. Jero had tied everything up neatly with her swift execution, and it would be impossible to find any further clues at this point. Turning the box over once more, Sinon saw that what she had thought was the underside was the lid, but no matter how much she pushed on it, the lid stayed shut fast. With a grim expression, she took a step towards Jero, but Arthur Telson stepped in her way. "What are you doing?" she asked, faint flames beginning to burn around her body. "The fight is over," the leader of the Adventurers Guild said. "The Ebony Association attacked us after the fight, and we're not allowed to defend ourselves." "The fight wasn't over yet," Jero said from behind Telson, a tight smile on her face. With an angry growl, Sinon took another step forward, but this time Carl Rackham appeared in front of her. "She's technically correct," Rackham said, his expression neutral. "If you would like to fight, you'll have to challenge her." In the stands, Morris stood with his hands clenched, glaring at Jero. He wasn't foolish enough to rush out, however, as the princess had been operating in secrecy. Besides, while he was close to the Shaper level, he wasn't yet there, and Jero would likely be able to slap him down with ease, to say nothing of the two men in front of her. Sinon's head turned, looking at Carl Rackham, and then at Arthur Telson. "I will remember this," she said, before looking once more toward Jero. She didn't say anything this time, just considering her for a moment before turning to walk away. Before she could get more than a few steps, however, Jero lifted her voice. "It would seem we are short one member to fill the 10 seats." It was impossible to miss the gloating in her voice, and Sinon stopped in place, speaking without turning around. "Garrett Klein isn't dead." "How could you possibly know that?" Jero asked. "He was sucked into that strange box, and who knows if he'll ever return." "Oh, do you know something we don't?" Sinon asked, turning her head to face Jero. With a smirk, Jero held her hands wide and shook her head. No. How could I? After all, I have no idea what that box is. I've never seen it before. Then I guess we're at an impasse, aren't we? Sinan replied. The seat belongs to the Klein family, and will continue to do so until Garrett is confirmed deceased. Do you really think that's something that you can just decide? Arthur Telson asked, his eyes narrowing dangerously. The only response he got was a cold chuckle as Sinan turned and walked away. Her dismissive attitude made the Adventurers Guild master furious, but before he could say anything, Thomas, who had just barely kept himself from being sucked into the box along with the other two, clapped his hands together, his stare beyond cold. I think what Sinan has said has merit, he said. I know I speak for everyone here when I say I am incredibly disappointed in what has happened here. As he spoke, his glare raked across Jero and Telson. Louise, the leader of the Silver Song, who had been watching everything with interest, started as she heard her voice being called, and quickly stood up. Yes, Thomas? I want a full investigation into that box and what it is, and more importantly, how it happened to come into the Ebony Association's hands, Thomas said, his eyes never leaving Jero and Arthur Telson. Spare no expense, and leave no stone unturned. Come. We're leaving, Sinan said, calling to everyone who had come in with her and Garrett. Gathering together, they stalked out of the arena, Sinan still holding the silver box. Morris was absolutely beside himself. Everyone else, though, was relatively calm. Finally, he simply couldn't stand it anymore. Reaching out to grab Sinan, he thought better of it at the last moment, after remembering the way she had burned through the metal hooks. Instead, he rushed in front of her. How can all of you be so calm? He snapped, causing Rin to step forward and silence him with a glare. Be quiet. If you're going to follow us, do so quietly. Gritting his teeth, all Morris could do was trail along as they headed out of the underground arena and back into the sewers. Once they were a good distance away, Rin looked at Morris, who was barely holding on to his temper, and spoke in a quiet voice, as if whispering a secret. Garrett and the princess are fine, she said, causing Morris to stiffen. What do you mean they're fine? I mean they're not in any immediate danger, Rin replied, shooting a glance at the box Sinan held. How do you know that? Morris asked. Rin shrugged and pointed at the box. Because Garrett said so. Don't ask how, but he can communicate with us. It's one of his awakened powers. They're in some sort of space inside the box. Apparently it's much bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. Once we get back to the inn, we'll do some research on it, figure out how to get them back out. Until then, keep your mouth shut, or you can stay here. Morris wanted to argue, but before he could, Sinan stopped and turned towards him, regarding him silently. He swallowed back the angry words he wanted to say, and followed the group quietly as they returned to the inn. Garrett was standing in a strange, gray world that looked surprisingly familiar. The same frayed carpet and fading wallpaper, the same worn, wooden detailing, and the occasional picture that simultaneously appeared to have a figure looking out of it, and nothing at all. Taking a deep breath, Garrett found it even smelled the same, musty and stale. Next to him, Princess Eloise gripped his arm tightly, her nails practically piercing his skin, as she tried to control her trembling. Over the last 6 months, Garrett had been in enough strange situations that getting sucked into a small box and finding himself in a familiar space wasn't that upsetting. For Princess Eloise, however, who didn't even know a space like this existed, it had been a shocking experience, and it was only now that she was beginning to calm down. Your Highness. Twitching slightly when she heard Garrett's voice, Princess Eloise looked down at him, her voice quivering. Yes? I'm about to start bleeding, Your Highness. It was only now that the princess realized she had been gripping tightly on Garrett's arm, and with a light cough, she released him. Taking a deep breath, she looked around. Where is this? An excellent question, Garrett replied, joining the princess and gazing around. He sent out a flicker of mental energy, using it to form the image of a flower behind Princess Eloise's back, testing to see if his abilities worked. They did, which meant that this was a liminal space, exactly like the endless halls of Isabel's mirror. However, this space wasn't the world inside of the mirror, and Garrett knew that for sure, because he had already tried controlling it. The hollow space inside the mirror was completely under Garrett's control, as Isabel was one of his guardians. This space was foreign, and resisted Garrett's mental energy, much like the hollow space in the mirror had when he first entered it. Thankfully, his connection with his guardians didn't seem to be hindered by anything, and he had been able to communicate clearly with both Sinan and Isabel. He had even managed to send out a message to calm down all of the dream flowers, as he was afraid if he didn't, they would immediately begin waging war. Garrett and the princess were currently in a long hallway that appeared to turn to the right up ahead, and the left behind them. There were a number of doors off of the hallway, each of them marked with a symbol. Yet even as Garrett watched, the symbols shifted, transforming into other symbols. Feeling Princess Eloise's soul spark lighting up, Garrett couldn't help but glance at her. He had known she was awakened in the mid-lighting stage, but he found himself curious about her power. "I should be able to protect us, at least a little bit," the princess said, taking a deep breath. And then, in a move that completely shocked Garrett, she gripped the back of his wheelchair, and began pushing him forward, down the hall. "Which way do you think we should go?" she asked, trying to keep the shaking out of her voice. "In a place like this, forward is as good as back," Garrett replied. "This is what's called a liminal space, an endless tangle of halls and rooms that all look the same. There are specific conditions for entering and exiting. For entering, it appears blood is necessary." "Do we need blood to exit?" Princess Eloise asked. "That's a good question," Garrett replied, "and one that hopefully we'll be able to find the answer to. If we can avoid having to cut our hands open, however, I think it would be a good thing." Tobe continued,